Good evening, everyone. I show 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started with tonight's program. I'm Joe Smith. I'm the AgriLife Extension Agent in Houston County, and this program tonight is one of our Ag in the Evening series sessions, and we're going to discuss common forage questions with Dr. Vanessa Olson out of Overton. This program got started back in April, I think, is when we had our first one due to the shutdown, and we decided to still provide the same quality education that we normally do face-to-face. We decided to do it online, and it's been very successful. And so we're wrapping up our September-October series for tonight, but we're going to continue through the end of the year. We have several more programs, and we'll just talk about those at the end of Vanessa's talk. So a few items to note, if you will keep your mic muted, and we've also found that you seem to have a better quality program if you turn off your video. For some reason, when you do that, it just seems to increase your quality. So if you do have issues, sometimes getting out and getting back in will also fix it. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. Dr. Olson can see those as well as I can see those, and we can get those answered throughout the program and then wrap up any questions we have at the end of the session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Olson with our common forage questions.
All right. Thanks, Joe. So like she said, my name is Vanessa Olson. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist in Overton. I do want to let everybody know this is being recorded. All of our programs that we have put on as part of the Ag in the Evening have been recorded, and they are posted on a YouTube channel. We're happy to share that link with you. So if you have missed previous programs, you have an opportunity to go back and watch or rewatch if you wanted to make sure you didn't miss anything. I'm also happy to share my slides. You don't have to worry about frantically trying to write everything down during the presentation. So we decided to select our topics for the forage topic this month and for a beef topic later, that we would cover some common forage questions. And when I first started to think about the common forage questions, it was a little overwhelming in regards to thinking about what are the questions that I get quite frequently or more commonly. And so some of them I've tried to make fairly broad, but then we can narrow our discussion and talk more specifically. But I did try to highlight some of the more common, may not necessarily cover everything, but hopefully we'll hit some highlights that can help you make some best management practices or some better decisions, or just some decisions in regards to your forage production systems. So probably the most common question I get is about weed control. How do I control weed X? And you can fill that in with any weed issues that you might have on your property. It could be a broadleaf weed, a grassy weed. Grassy weeds are probably more commonly asked because they are the more difficult at times to actually control, especially controlling a grass within a grass system can be very challenging. And most of us obviously do not want to cause damage to our warm season perennial, whether it's Bermuda grass or Bahia grass. Part of that, a lot of times I get the question about, or the comment, I don't know where it came from. It's never been on my property before, where it wasn't here last year. I've never seen this weed. And it can be very frustrating, and we start to try to solve that problem in hopes that we can fix and keep other weeds from becoming a problem on our property. And there are some things we can do to try to reduce the possibility to introduce new species or undesired species on our property. One is know our hay source. If we are buying hay, we can obviously easily move or bring in weeds in hay, whether it's hay that we've produced or hay we've purchased from an unknown source. So that is obviously a way we can introduce weeds. Equipment, livestock, dogs that run, around in the neighborhood, other wildlife, birds obviously can drop seed. The wind can introduce seed. If you have flooding or other environmental situations, storms may move in seed or create environmental conditions that really support maybe some of those undesired species. As far as controlling weeds, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We've had weed control discussions before. Now's the time of year where I end up doing a lot of weed control programs. So there are other opportunities to get more details, but some cultural practices, some things that we can do to help reduce weed populations or weed competition. Soil fertility, maintaining our forage production by maintaining soil fertility and soil pH, and that will come up as a common question. Promoting our desired forages by maintaining that soil fertility, creating competition. That may mean, boosting our forage production, interseeding, or adding additional sprigs to a sprig Bermuda grass field to fill in bare spots or areas where production has diminished over time. As always, if you are looking to establish or you're planting, make sure you are selecting forages that are adapted to your location and your management. And we'll talk about that in more detail as well. And if we're trying to grow a species or a variety that's not adapted to our environment, that is when we can often have some weed encroachment, because anything that is adapted to that environment will thrive as long as it has the environmental conditions that support that growth, whether it's a lot of moisture, well-drained soils, nutrients, lack of nutrients, what have you. Chemical control is typically the best recommendation. Mechanical control can be a method, but the use of herbicides, if used appropriately, can be very effective at controlling many of our weed species. So, as I already started talking about methods of weed control, mowing is frequently used because of instant gratification. Unfortunately, it's not very effective. To control annual weeds such as goat weed, we'd have to mow quite frequently. And mowing also creates an opportunity to spread seeds. So that is something we have to keep in mind if we're thinking about using mowing as an option or a method of weed control. Mowing is also going to be more expensive in most cases, even if we're looking at the additional cost of a herbicide. And this economic comparison of a rotary mower versus a boom sprayer, with a wider width of a boom sprayer, we're going to cover more acres and reduce our time that it takes to make those applications, and also any labor cost. But obviously, we do have the cost of the herbicide. And in this particular case, Grazon Next HL, which is a very common broadleaf herbicide, is only typically about $9 an acre at 1.5 pints. Even with that additional cost, the use of a herbicide is still going to be more economical compared to mowing, almost a $4 acre difference. So almost $4 an acre more expensive to mow versus using an appropriate herbicide. Of course, with the use of pesticides, herbicides, the label is the law. It will be important to follow label directions to make sure that that product is safe within your forage production system, that is safe for your species of forage that you are growing. It'll also give you application rates, timing of application recommendations, and a lot of very useful information that can help you be effective with your weed control, as well as cause minimal damage to your desired forage. So as part of weed control, reading the label will be very important. So I did want to talk about a few grassy weeds, because those are the most common as far as weed questions that I get. In pasture and range, we have a lot of general broadleaf herbicide options. Whenever it comes to grassy weed control, we're often limited on our options or effective control methods. Crabgrass is a warm season annual. This year, I've had more questions about crabgrass than in the past. We had a very wet spring. I think that really played into our crabgrass production or germination of those seeds that had been laying there for who knows how long. A lot of people also saw more crabgrass in areas of their pasture where production was limited, where Bermuda grass was starting to thin, or potentially there was, quote unquote, a dead spot. So we started to see some crabgrass show up in those locations. As far as treatment options, we have a couple of options. As far as post-emergent, glyphosate or Roundup can be very effective. It can be applied following a hay harvest. It can also be applied even during good growing conditions within a pasture system. Another option is Pastora. Pastora will have activity on large crabgrass. It is labeled for Bermuda grass pastures and hay meadows. Just like Roundup and Pastora will both kill Bahia grass. So if you have Bahia grass, I would like to keep it. I would recommend looking at a pre-emergent option. Our pre-emergent option right now, well, there's two options. One of the newest pre-emergent options is called Resilon. We'll have activity on crabgrass as well as some other grassy weeds, so that might be of interest to you. The recommendation on application for Resilon is 3 ounces before Labor Day in September, and then a second application of 3 ounces before Valentine's Day in February. So it's a kind of a 2-step application process to be effective, to especially be effective with Resilon. Prow H2O is another pre-emergent option. Based on some research in Texas, Resilon has been more effective on crabgrass than Prow H2O. So we do have some pre-emergent as well as post-emergent options. Dallas grass is another grassy weed that's often confused with crabgrass. They both tend to show up in very similar environments, soils that hold or have quite a bit of moisture, or when you've had a little bit more rainfall than normal. Dallas grass is a warm season perennial, so it can be trickier to control compared to crabgrass. So in comparison, to look at the seed heads, on the left is the Dallas grass seed head, and on the right is a crabgrass seed head. When you're just looking at the grasses, it's a little bit more challenging, but the seed heads are very distinguishable comparing those two species. Dallas grass can be grazed just as crabgrass can be utilized for grazing as well. However, both are deemed undesirable, especially in a hay meadow. As far as control of Dallas grass, our best option, our only option right now is Roundup. We're not aware that the new Resilon from Bayer, that new pre-emergent, is going to have any activity on Dallas grass. We do have an opportunity in the kind of early winter on Dallas grass. Well, once we've had a frost and Bermuda grass has gone dormant, Dallas grass tends to stay green longer. So there is going to be a window of opportunity where you could apply Roundup and have minimal fear in regards to causing damage to your Bermuda grass when that Bermuda grass is dormant and that Dallas grass is still actively growing. Other grassy weeds, Johnson grass, a very common question on controlling Johnson grass. It is also a warm season perennial, and it can be utilized for forage as well. We tend to see Johnson grass in areas that have not been managed along roadsides, may show up in a pasture if we've been overgrazing or we haven't fertilized in a while, or if we've acquired new property, and that is very common. We've purchased new property, we inherited new property that hasn't been managed in a long time, and we may have some Johnson grass in those locations. Several post-emergent options. Roundup will obviously have activity on Johnson grass, so that can be an option. Pastora has activity on seedling Johnson grass. Another option is a product called Outrider. Outrider is very important to understand. Per the label, do not mow 2 weeks prior or 2 weeks after application. So you have to have at least 18 inches of growth on that Johnson grass to be effective with Outrider. So if you are trying to control Johnson grass in a hay meadow, you may want to really think about Outrider as an option in regards to how is that going to fall on your timeline? Will that work with your hay schedule? If not, I think Pastora or Roundup following a hay harvest would be a better option as far as controlling Johnson grass. Another grass species that's often confused with Johnson grass is Vasey grass. Vasey grass looks fairly similar in the fact that it grows very tall. It has a very tall seed head. Even though it is not a bunch grass, it appears to be very similar. Vasey grass has a more narrow leaf and does not have that white midrib that we saw in the previous picture on Johnson grass. Vasey grass is much more challenging. We have fewer options. Roundup during early vegetative growth can be effective at helping to reduce some of that Vasey grass. It is a perennial, So it will take more than one application likely to have effective control. Another option, Pastora, will suppress vacey grass. It will not kill vacey grass, but that can help to reduce seed head expression and continuation of that population on your property. So those are some very common weed questions. Another one, depending on your location in East Texas, if you have a bottom or you get further into Southeast Texas, smut grass is a very common question. And there may be some areas even in, the Rusk, Gregg, Houston area, Houston County locations where there are some low-lying areas and we've seen some smut grass. I get quite a few smut grass questions. And unfortunately, smut grass is very challenging. It is a warm season perennial. We are very lucky. Dr. Scott Nolte, our weed specialist at College Station, has started doing some research, has been for the past 3 years, doing some research on smut grass control, looking at fire, cultivation, trying to plow it up or disturb that soil, mowing, has also looked at quote unquote intensive grazing, where you increase some grazing pressure to try to kind of force it out. Unfortunately, what they have found to be most effective is glyphosate at fairly high rates that can unfortunately cause injury to our warm season perennials that we find desirable. And the other option is Velpar L. Hexazinone is the active ingredient in this product. It is going to be fairly expensive, much more expensive than Roundup. In their experience, they have found that 4.5 pints per acre has the most effective control on smut grass with Velpar L. As you can see, as that rate gets higher, for our hay restrictions start at 4.5 pints or higher. Grazing restrictions, if we apply more than 4.5 pints per acre, we do have a grazing restriction as well. So very important to pay attention to that. A rope or a wick applicator with glyphosate can potentially be effective, will require repeat applications. And most people complain about the process of using a rope or a wick applicator because it takes longer. You have to drive slower. You need to be much more methodical in making sure that you get application of that herbicide to both sides of the leaves on that plant. So I talked to a gentleman today, and he asked if he could solve his smut grass problem with one application. And unfortunately, that is not the case. That is not going to be the case with majority, if not all, of our weed problems, whether it's a grassy weed or a broadleaf weed. Most often, we're going to need repeat applications, potentially within the season, and definitely over years or multiple years, as we try to reduce those populations and then improve our forage production to create competition against those weed species. Another one that I get questions about that, once again, as we talk about weeds are, is a plant out of place. So that's going to be based on your particular production system. Ryegrass, volunteer ryegrass in a hay meadow is found undesirable, especially in the spring as that ryegrass is growing very actively, and it can outcompete our Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or our other warm season perennials that we're trying to grow, that are trying to break dormancy and take advantage of any spring rainfalls that we have. So controlling ryegrass, we have several options. We can graze if our hay meadows have fencing and water. We can graze that ryegrass and graze it down to the point where our warm season perennials can start actively growing. We can use several products, post-emergent products, Roundup or glyphosate, can be very effective. Pastora has activity on ryegrass. Products that have metsulfuron methyl, such as Cimarron Plus, will have activity on ryegrass. And then pre-emergent options, Resilon that I mentioned earlier has activity on cool season annual ryegrass, as well as Prow H2O will have activity on cool season annual ryegrass. Sandburrs, another grassy weed that we get in Central and East Texas can be quite a problem. Very important to understand, even though it is quote unquote an annual, it can perenniate. It can survive, especially if we have mild winters. And as warm as we are right now, and based on predictions, I think we're going to have a warmer than normal, warmer than average winter. So those plants can actually perenniate and survive our mild winters. As far as control options, Prow H2O as a pre-emergent is an option on sandburs. Prow H2O will also have activity on Johnson grass, crabgrass, many of our annual foxtails, and several other, even on some broadleaf weeds. One thing to keep in mind, the effectiveness of Prow H2O is highly dependent on rainfall. So you need about 1.5 inches in a fairly short period of time following application to have true effectiveness with Prow H2O. Already mentioned Resilon. Resilon is one of our newest forage herbicide released by Bayer. We'll have activity on many of these species that I've mentioned: crabgrass, ryegrass, our annual foxtails, and we'll also have activity on sandburs. If you are using Resilon for pre-emergent control on sandburs, you will absolutely need the 2 applications, one in the fall and then one in the spring. And if you have any sandburs that perenniate or survive this season or overwinter, you will need post-emergent application in the spring, summer, and fall potentially to control any of those plants. So Resilon is only going to have or prevent seed germination. So any plants that survive during the winter, neither Prow H2O nor Resilon will have any activity on. So that will require a post-emergent product. Glyphosate has activity on sandburs as it does on a lot of species. As far as safe rates, a pint per acre following a hay harvest, 10 to 12 ounces during good growing conditions can be effective on sandburs. Do keep in mind we can often have what appears to be kind of 2 seasons of sandburs. They will germinate in the spring. We can have a kind of a beginning of the season flush. We may not see very much germination during the summer when we are very hot and dry, but once we have some fall moisture, we can kind of have a second flush or another flush of sandburs. So you're often needing more than one post-emergent application within that season. Pastora, previously mentioned, is going to have activity on sandburs. Active ingredients are metsulfuron, methyl, and nicosulfuron. So that metsulfuron methyl will kill Bahia grass. So if you have Bahia grass, we have fewer options in regards to sandbur control. So our next common forage question is, do I need to apply the amount of fertilizer the soil test calls for? So we're here to talk about soil testing. Soil testing is very important in regards to making fertilizer decisions. If you have questions about your soil analysis in regards to what it means, if how you can adjust or if you should adjust those recommendations, I highly recommend you discuss that with an agronomist, someone like myself, someone from College Station, your county extension agent. They can be very helpful in helping you or giving you some guidance or helping you make those decisions. Obviously, our goal as forage producers should be to obtain optimum forage production, so our best forage production, maybe not the most forage production, but what we need for our livestock or forage systems. Stand persistence should be very important. In the past year, I have fielded a lot of phone calls and emails about thinning of stands or loss of stands. And one of the Ag in the Evening programs was about Bermuda grass decline or thinning of our warm season perennial stands, and we focus on that. It'll be important to maintain the forage species you desire. If you are trying to keep a stand of coastal Bermuda grass, maintaining soil fertility and soil pH will be important. And remember, plants need nutrients to grow, to persist, and to be productive. In regards to soil testing, if you have a hay meadow, I recommend annual testing in a hay meadow. Because we are harvesting a majority of those nutrients into those bales of hay, we're selling them to someone else, we're feeding them to our livestock. at another location. By collecting soil samples, by having those analyzed, we're giving ourselves credit for any nutrients that carry over from season to season, especially in our grazing systems. If you are grazing, I recommend a soil analysis every 3 to 5 years. One of my first recommendations, if you have any issues, if you have noticed a decrease in production, a thinning of stands, maybe you've started to see more weeds, one of my first recommendations is a soil analysis. A lot of our weeds can be indicators of poor management, whether that's, lacking on fertilizing or lime applications. So a soil analysis will be important to help make those fertilizer decisions. In regards to how to collect soil samples, we need to treat each management area separately. So a management area is going to be defined as less than 50 acres that is managed the same, that has the same forage species, same forage variety, and is being managed or utilized in the same manner. So a 50-acre hay meadow is one management area. A 20-acre pasture is a second management area. So you would collect soil samples for those fields separately. So in that case, you would send off 2 soil samples, one for the hay meadow and one for the pasture. But you're not just collecting one handful of soil, so to speak, from that hay meadow. You're going to collect 15 to 20 cores at a 6-inch depth, randomly selected within that hay meadow, mixed in a clean plastic bucket or a clean container. Do not recommend a metal container. You can use a paper bag potentially, or even a Ziploc bag. Mix those different samples that you've collected from that hay meadow, and then you're going to pull a composite. So you want a composite or one representation of that entire hay meadow. And basically you are sending a pint of soil to the lab for analysis. You can pick up soil bags and forms from your local county extension office. If you prefer not to get out and about these days, you can download the forms from their website, which is soiltesting.tamu.edu, and then you can use your own container to ship that sample. All of those samples would go to College Station if you are using Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Lab. You can use SFA in Nacogdoches, but we do not process any samples at the Overton Research and Extension Center. As far as our essential nutrients, we're going to talk about those very briefly, and we can even talk about sources of those nutrients. So our primary nutrients we're going to focus on are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, N, P, and K. They are our primary nutrients. They are needed in the largest quantity. On a routine soil analysis, you will also see secondary nutrients along with soil pH. Micronutrients would be an additional fee, and that routine soil analysis will cost you about $12. So if we look at Bermuda grass, production, if we are looking at our primary nutrients to produce 1 ton of coastal Bermuda grass, you will need 50 pounds of nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and 42 pounds of potassium. So I like to remember those numbers when I start thinking about recommendations, or just to keep in mind how much of those nutrients it actually takes to produce a ton of Bermuda grass. So obviously, if you want more production, you're going to have to increase those nutrients. So we're going to talk about each one of those and why they are important very briefly. Nitrogen, of course, we understand the more nitrogen we pour into that hay meadow, we're going to increase the quantity of forage we produce, so the production. We will also increase the crude protein content, or a measure of nutritive value. Phosphorus will be important for root growth and development. And it'll also be important for water use efficiency. If we are looking to establish have a new planting or establish a new field, phosphorus will be very important for seedlings or sprigs as they start to grow in development, because it is important for root growth and development. Potassium, I like to say potassium is for persistence, especially on Bermuda grass. We need almost as much potassium as we do nitrogen. And in my experience, where I start to see thinning or declines of Bermuda grass, it is most often a result of a potassium deficiency. If you are in very sandy soils in East Texas, or even have sandy soils in the central part of our state, it is very important that you are performing soil tests on a regular basis, because our sandy soils are naturally deficient in many of our nutrients, and do not hold on to things like potassium. So we can much more frequently have a potassium deficiency as opposed to a heavier clay or black land clay soil. Soil pH can be another very important aspect of our fertility programs, of our soil nutrient status. And this is kind of a broad general table. The blue line indicates a soil pH of 5.8. Keep in mind that different forage species and different varieties of forage species can have different sensitivities to soil pH, whether they will tolerate a lower soil pH, or they prefer a higher soil pH. So take, for example, ryegrass. Cool season annual ryegrass typically prefers a soil pH of at least 6. So many of our legumes, our cool season or even warm season legumes, will typically prefer a soil pH of at least 6. In regards to Bermuda grass, some of our varieties, such as Tifton 85, is going to be much more sensitive to soil pH as opposed to coastal or even common Bermuda grass. So what happens is, as our soil pHs shift, whether they become too low for that species or even too high, that changes the availability of nutrients. It can change the availability of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as well as it changes the availability of some of our micronutrients. And sometimes those micronutrients can become toxic and cause damage to the root structure, which makes it more difficult for that plant to take up or to pull from the soil things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So make sure you are paying attention to your soil analysis as far as your soil pH. If you have questions about what is an appropriate soil pH for a given forage species, please visit with myself or your county extension agent to help you make more economical decisions. So this is just an example of what a soil analysis might look like. This is for improved hybrid Bermuda grass, not irrigated, with potential of 3 harvests. The results are in the second column. This is very similar to what you would actually see on your soil report, where it says the level. It would actually have a bar, kind of a shaded bar, indicating those different levels instead of the words typed out. The units are in parts per million. I do not think in parts per million. I prefer to think in pounds per acre. So one thing you can do is, as you are looking at this, if you look at nitrate nitrogen is 21 parts per million, if you multiply that by 2, that will convert that to pounds per acre. So what you have available based on that soil analysis is 42 pounds per acre of nitrate nitrogen. Now remember, for a coastal Bermuda grass, just to produce a ton, you need 50 pounds of nitrogen. So as you can see, there's fertilizer recommendations for nitrogen. Phosphorus is very high. Potassium is low, so there is a recommendation for potassium. If you look at the very bottom of the slide where it says potassium, you will notice it recommends splitting that potassium application, even though it recommends 120 pounds of K2O per acre, or your source of potassium per acre. It recommends splitting that application. Bermuda grass can be a luxury consumer of potassium, so following that recommendation will be important in regards to not having potassium throughout the season available for that plant, so you don't end up with a deficiency at the end of the season. There was a question, and I'll go ahead and address it in the chat. It says, in a low potassium soil, should you apply it earlier than nitrogen? In regards to our nutrients, nitrogen is very mobile. So phosphorus and potassium are not very mobile. They do not move in our environment. So we can apply potassium at any time during the growing season, or even on dormant forage. So my recommendation is, if you are applying potassium for Bermuda grass, you can make that application in the spring. If that is when you are looking to make your fertilizer application, you can make that potassium application with your first nitrogen application. You could apply it earlier. If you do have low potassium in your soil, then you probably have a fairly high recommendation. So you will need to split that application. So you can apply potassium by itself later throughout the season, or you can coordinate that with a nitrogen application if you're also applying nitrogen. So it comes down to what's going to work feasibly for you, maybe based on availability of a truck or of a spreader. It may depend on that particular situation. If we are applying potassium during the fall and winter for our cool season forages and we're grazing those, we will have carryover. We're not going to lose that potassium if we apply it and then we don't have rainfall to follow. So those applications can be made whenever they need to be made or whenever it works within your forage system. Another common question that I get, especially when there has been anything that has impacted our warm season perennial stand production. Can I broadcast grass seed to fill in or to thicken my weak grass stand? I got that question quite frequently following the drought of 2011, when a lot of people had lower production on their warm season perennials following the drought that following season. They had dead spots or thinning. The one thing whenever I get that question is that is an option as long as you realize you are potentially going to have a mixed stand. So a lot of people ask that question. I have coastal Bermuda grass. I want it to fill back in, but I don't have the time or patience, or I don't want to have any weed issues. What if I threw out some seeded Bermuda grass? Would that be okay? Yes, that is fine. You can do that. However, you're going to have a mixed stand. A lot of people think that slowly that coastal Bermuda grass will outcompete that other Bermuda grass variety, and that is not necessarily the case. In Overton, Dr. Roquette has seen Tifton 85 outcompete some other Bermuda grass varieties, but I think that is a unique situation, and that should not be assumed to be a guarantee in every situation. So if you are okay with that mixed stand, then that is something you just need to keep in mind. A lot of people, for various reasons, would like to have a pure stand. Now you can always add or try to incorporate more sprigs. A lot of people have, if they have a bare spot of coastal Bermuda grass, they will, dig some sprigs, or they will try to feed hay in that area to try to increase the coastal Bermuda grass or fill that bare spot in. If you are adding additional seed, it will be important that you have good seed to soil contact. So that may mean mowing down some thatch in that area to open up the canopy to increase seed to soil contact. It may mean a light disking in that area to break up any thatch to help with seed to soil contact. That Bermuda grass seed would need to be 1/4 to 1/2 inch. You could do the same with Bahia grass. You could fill in, add some additional Bahia grass seed to increase or bump up some production, but you would need to ensure that seed to soil contact to be successful. You will also need to follow with weed control. You may, if you do any soil disturbance, you may promote some seed germination of some undesired grasses or broadleaf weeds. So you may need to pay attention to weed control as well. Keep in mind those seedlings will be more sensitive to herbicide applications. And so the herbicide recommendation will be very different for that part of the field as opposed to the rest that may be well established. So keep that in mind if you are making some herbicide applications in that location. As far as establishment, if you're looking to completely reestablish a warm season perennial, whether it is with sprigs of a hybrid Bermuda grass or if you're deciding to plant a seed, these are just some general guidelines for establishing warm season perennial forages. Always recommend starting with a soil analysis. Make sure when you do so, you tell them on the form that is a new planting or will be a new planting. They will focus on phosphorus, since phosphorus is going to be important for root growth and development. You will have to kill any existing vegetation, whether it is Bermuda grass or a bunch of Johnson grass, what have you, to create that well-prepared seed bed and reduce any potential competition. I will tell you during the establishment year, weed control will be very important. If you have questions about weed control during an establishment year, there's an excellent publication on Forage Facts that has some recommendations, especially for newly sprigged Bermuda grass, because that is another very common question. During establishment, you can incorporate any lime, phosphorus, or potassium that is recommended. Do not apply any nitrogen until you have seed germination and active growth. You do not want to feed any weeds potentially. And once again, nitrogen is a very mobile nutrient. Without plants there to actually utilize that nitrogen, you could lose it either to volatilization, to escaping into our atmosphere, leaching, moving through our soil profile, especially in our sandy soils. So next question is, what should I plant period, or what should I plant to improve my pasture stand? Anytime we talk about planting or introducing a new forage species, the first thing is location, location, location. Where you are in the state of Texas will heavily influence the forage species and may even influence the variety of a species that is recommended. So not only the county that you're in, but very specific things in regards to your soil type. Do you have well-drained sandy soils? Do you have a heavier clay soil? Do you have a bottom that can periodically flood or holds more moisture? And then also think about what your overall goals are as a forage producer or as a livestock producer. You obviously want to look at a forage or for forage species that match your management style, your management goals. If you are supporting livestock, when do you need a fairly high quality forage? When are you looking to graze? Are you primarily going to be grazing during the summer? So you obviously would want a warm season perennial potentially as your forage base. Also think about, what is it going to take to maintain that stand of forage? Will it persist for a long period of time under my management style or my perceived desired management? Several things to think about. You do also want to make sure that selection fits your overall, not only your production system goals, but your lifestyle goals. So there's other things that are likely to be important to you as well. So you want to make sure it fits within that. So like I mentioned, location, location, location. There's an excellent tool, the Web Soil Survey. If you just Google Web Soil Survey, you can locate that. It's an excellent tool by using GPS coordinates or an address, a physical address. You can view a bird's eye view of your property and look at the different soil characteristics, different types of soil, those characteristics and descriptions of those soils within your acreage. And that can help make decisions on what will be best adapted or what will feasibly do well or be productive in those various soil types. As far as what you might plant and differences between some of these, most of our forage systems throughout the Southeast are based on a warm season perennial forage. Bahia grass and Bermuda grass are probably some of the most popular throughout the Southeast. Both are what we would call introduced. Neither one of these species is native to Texas or native to the United States. They were both introduced because they are well adapted to very tropical environments, high rainfall, drought tolerance, very warm temperatures. They go dormant during the winter, and they can persist with appropriate management. Now, a lot of people ask, what should I plant, Bermuda grass or Bahia grass? Once again, it comes down to what you're doing and maybe what your preference. A lot of people are very attracted to and find Bermuda grass the most appealing compared to Bahia grass. Bermuda grass is more drought tolerant than Bahia grass. Both will tolerate close continuous grazing, so they're both excellent for grazing livestock. Bahia grass is going to be more challenging to produce hay off of because it matures very quickly, has a very tough stem, so it can really dull cutter blades very quickly. So that can be a challenge. It is very competitive against other weeds, so that can be desirable. Bermuda grass is very productive. Bahia grass is fairly productive as far as nutritive value. Bahia grass is comparable to coastal Bermuda grass. Of our Bermuda grass varieties, Tipton 85 is the most productive and the highest of nutritive value. But those hybrid varieties will also require more inputs compared to common Bermuda grass, which is a seeded type variety of Bermuda grass. Some people view common Bermuda grass as undesirable as a weed, or is perceived as a weed. It is very productive. It just does not produce a lot of vertical growth. So it's not necessarily the best Bermuda grass variety option for hay production, but for grazing, it's very appropriate for a grazing system. So in regards to differences between those are some of those differences. It may come down to a personal preference. It may also come down to what is already established and what works well for you within your forage system. A lot of people ask about native grass species. Once again, Bermuda grass and Bahia grass are not native to the state of Texas. Native species would include little bluestem, big bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass, eastern gamma grass, grama. There are several other native species. Some of those will grow in East Texas. Most are going to do better in the more central or more arid part of our state. And the heavier soils in the central and even into West Texas. But there are some native species that we can grow in East Texas. They require very different management compared to Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, especially in regards to grazing. They will not tolerate that close continuous grazing that Bermuda grass and Bahia grass tolerate. A lot of other forage species, most people, their forage base is a warm season perennial, and then they incorporate other annual species, especially cool season annuals such as ryegrass or small grains, to extend that grazing season on into winter and the spring. A lot of legumes, native legumes, introduced legumes, cool season annual legumes that we can utilize for livestock, for attracting wildlife, depending on what your forage system goals are. So we have a lot of options. It's just very important to get the best recommendation for your location and what you're trying to achieve. We will get to some additional questions towards the end, so I don't confuse everybody. Another popular question is, how many cows can I graze per acre? And that will be very dependent on a lot of things. Stocking rate, or number of animals per acre, or number of acres per animal, is a constantly moving target. Our forage production is influenced by fertility. Fertilizer is also going to be influenced by weather, especially rainfall. Temperatures can influence forage production as well. So oftentimes we're going to have to be very flexible or have a variable stocking rate, where we can potentially remove animals from a pasture or maybe add more animals at given times. Or if we don't have animals to add, we can always harvest extra forage if we have more forage production than our animals can actually graze down. So in my opinion, I would much rather have extra forage as opposed to having to purchase additional forage to fill in or to meet the needs of my animals, because I'm overstocked. I have more animals than I can produce forage to match. So how many acres do you need per cow? Obviously, you need to know how many grazable acres you have. Most of us hopefully know that. May need to take out some wooded area or a pond that's taking up part of our acreage or what have you. But we need to know how many acres can actually be grazed, that is fenced, that has access to water, that we're actually using for grazing. And then we also need to keep in mind forage consumption. How much forage are our animals actually consuming? And so, courtesy of Dr. Banta, general intake guidelines for a dry gestating cow is 1.8 to 2% of her body weight. For a lactating cow, it's obviously going to be higher than that as a percentage of her body weight. And then we also have to keep in mind, as our forage quality changes, that's going to change our forage intake. So our higher quality forages, which would be our cool season forages, our annual forages. So cool season annual ryegrass is going to be higher in nutritive value than Bermuda grass or Bahia grass. So those are these two pictures, ryegrass on the left and then some warm season perennial on the right. So our cool seasons are going to be higher in nutritive value than our warm seasons. Our annual forages will be higher in nutritive value than our perennials. So if we look within our warm season, within our summer, crabgrass is actually higher in nutritive value than Bermuda grass because it is an annual forage. When we have high quality forage, we're going to have higher intake. When we have lower quality forage that's very mature, it's late in the season, we're going to have lower intake. So just to do a little bit of math, estimated annual intake, if you assume a cow consumes 2.25% of her body weight on a dry matter basis, and say she weighs 1,000 pounds, then she consumes 22.5 pounds per day. Multiply that by 365 days, and she consumes well over 8,000 pounds of dry matter per year. So if we know, or if we can estimate our forage production, we can determine how many acres we need per cow. The next question is allowance. How much forage should she be allowed to consume? So should you let your animals consume everything that is produced? And no, we shouldn't, because that is when we can become overgrazed. We can add so much pressure to those forages that they're unable to recover or regrow and to continue to be productive. So we do want to leave some stubble height for our introduced species, Bermuda grass or Bahia grass. We can let our animals consume about 70% of that forage that is out there. So based on she needs a little over 8,000 pounds of dry matter per year, we need to produce almost 12,000 pounds of dry matter. Because she's going to consume 70% of that, we need to make sure we have more than that 70%. All right, so if we're looking at our warm season perennials and our forage allowance based on cow and calf intake is almost 14,000 pounds of dry matter per year. And we're going to let her consume, that's her allowance. She's consuming 70% of the forage, and our forage production in pounds per acre per year is 6,000 pounds of dry matter. Then our stocking rate would be about 2 acres per cow-calf pair. Obviously, if our cow weight increases, then our stocking rate is going to shift. We're obviously going to need more forage allowance because she weighs more, and therefore we're going to need more acres to support that cow-calf pair. If our forage production is reduced because of drought, or we've reduced our fertilization because of economics or availability or for whatever reason, or if we have a forage that's not nearly as productive, then our stocking rate will have to shift. It will require more acres to support that cow-calf pair because of lower forage production. So forage production is going to be influenced by fertility and weather. It can also be influenced by our species or variety selection. And then we need to make sure we are managing our stocking rates appropriately so that we are not overgrazing those forages and adding undue stress to those warm season perennials. In overgrazing, that's when those forages will not survive drought conditions. We're also likely to see more weed issues in those overgrazed pastures. And that is often when we need to start feeding additional hay or supplementation because we have reduced our forage production. So those were just some of the larger, more common forage questions. There may be additional ones, and I'll be happy to address some of the questions that have popped up during my presentation. So one of the first questions is in regards to Resilon, the new product by Bayer that I mentioned earlier. it says, to control your ryegrass crop, do you change schedule application, and is there residue to prevent next season germination? Okay, so Resolon is the trade name. The active ingredient is indaziflam. So indaziflam will help prevent seed germination. Based on research out of College Station, they have found you can have ryegrass control by making one application in the before February, or during February before Valentine's Day, so January, February time period. However, if you think about, if you have volunteer ryegrass, in some parts of our state, ryegrass has already germinated. So to have the most effective control, they do recommend kind of the two-step program, making a fall application, and they suggest in September before Labor Day or around Labor Day, at 3 ounces per acre, and then another application in February before Valentine's Day at 3 ounces per acre. If you are not able, and in this case, Resolon was not on the market in Texas until September. So if you wanted to apply Resolon still this fall, but you had some seed that had already germinated, you can still apply Resolon in the fall, but they also recommend you add a post-emergent. So you could add Pastora, Cimarron Plus, Roundup with that Resolon. That will kill any ryegrass that has already germinated and then prevent seeds that are going to germinate throughout the season. Now, if you applied Resolon in February, it is not going to have such a residual that it will prevent ryegrass from germinating that next fall. So if you apply in February 2021, they would still recommend you make a fall application for that next season of ryegrass in the fall of 2021. So if you have any more specific questions about that, I will be happy to address those. There was a question in regards to soil sampling and use of a container. The question is, can you use a stainless steel container? I would recommend a clean plastic bucket. Would still be my recommendation as far as not having any contamination within that bucket. All right. I think there are still some additional questions. Considering rainfall doesn't come as forecasted, and I've spread fertilizer, what happens to nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium? So that's an excellent question. So we'll address nitrogen first. So that will depend on your source of nitrogen. So we have several sources of nitrogen. Ammonium nitrate is a very common source. It may not be sold by all retailers because it does require additional insurance because it is a risk for use of an explosive. Ammonium nitrate is not very mobile. You can apply ammonium nitrate to a dry soil and it will wait for rainfall. So you're not going to lose that nitrogen to volatilization. So that is the source of nitrogen that I recommend using, especially when we are hot and dry and do not have nearly the chances for rainfall that we might have in the spring and sometimes in the fall. Not necessarily right now, apparently, but for spring and fall or times of the year when we have greater chances for moisture, urea is an excellent source of nitrogen. It is 46% nitrogen, so it's our highest percentage of nitrogen source. However, urea is highly volatile. That means that it can escape into our atmosphere. So applying that and waiting for rainfall can be risky with urea, and it's going to be more risky with urea compared to ammonium nitrate. Phosphorus and potassium we are not going to lose if they have to sit there and wait for rainfall. So our source of nitrogen will impact that potential loss, and urea is going to have the greatest potential for volatilization compared to ammonium nitrate. So your nitrogen source will influence that. Now, there are some urease inhibitors and other products that can be applied to urea to reduce some of that volatilization risk. There is a agritane, which is a urease inhibitor, is fairly cost effective and can reduce volatilization of urea. There is also a product called Smart Nitrogen. I think it's ESN Smart Nitrogen. It basically is a capsule around that urea. They do tell you, and there is research that shows it does really create a slow release of that nitrogen. So if in a hay production system, if you applied that product to your urea for that first application, you may not see the production in that first cutting that you would historically see, because you're going to have a much more slower release of that nitrogen. There are some other products that are out there that are not very effective at reducing that volatilization. Those are two that I'm very aware of that are effective at reducing volatilization of nitrogen with a urea source. They're not products that need to be applied to ammonium sulfate or ammonium nitrate. Another source of nitrogen is urea ammonium nitrate. That is a liquid source. It is half urea and half ammonium nitrate. So you still have that risk of volatilization from that urea. Oh, sorry about that. If there are additional questions, please continue to add those to the chat. I did want to tell you about some additional upcoming parts of our Ag in the Evening program. There is another Ag in the Evening program on December 8th. It is not listed on this slide. My apologies. Dr. Jason Banta will be hosting and presenting on common questions in beef cattle production on that particular evening. It will also be at 6 p.m. If you have any questions on how to have access or how to register for that program, please reach out to one of the county agents that is part of this program, including Joe Smith in Houston County. Jacob Spivey and Shaniqua Davis are also agents that you can reach out to. Shaniqua Davis is in Gregg County and Jacob Spivey is in Tyler County. You can also reach out to myself or Dr. Banta, and we can help give you more information on any of these programs or where to find previously recorded ones as well. We do have some CEU opportunities on November 10th and December 15th. Each one of those will provide 2 CEUs, so they will be 2-hour programs. There is a fee since we are offering CEUs. All of these other programs have been free, but as we provide CEUs, we do have to charge for those. And so here's some additional information on those 2 opportunities. There's another question. I said that I mentioned ammonium sulfate. What is my opinion of ammonium sulfate? Ammonium sulfate is an option for nitrogen fertilizer. Do have to keep in mind that the sulfur component of ammonium sulfate is acidifying. So in our sandy soils in East Texas, we just have to be careful, make sure we are paying attention to our soil pH. It is 3 times as acidifying as our other nitrogen sources. And so for every pound of ammonium sulfate to counteract that acidifying effect, I think you need about 5 to 8 pounds of lime. So I would pay attention to your soil pH. You may need to, as a result of using ammonium sulfate, you may need to apply some lime. So I would look at not only the cost, look at the cost comparison of different nitrogen sources, but also look at the cost of lime. So that may make ammonium sulfate less economical if you're also having to lime to counter that acidifying effect. That is a way to add sulfur if you need some sulfur in your soils, which our sandy soils can be deficient in sulfur. Sulfur is important for forage production, but we do not need as large of quantities. It is considered a micronutrient compared to NP and K. If you have additional forage questions, my Forage Facts website can be very helpful. There are several publications that can help answer some forage questions. You can also locate my contact information. Joe has shared the link for the CEU programs where you can register for those in November and December, as well as her email address. So if you have additional questions about Ag in the Evening programs, you can reach out to either one of us.